Canadian Institute of Climate Choices. Dale is the Vice President of Research and Analysis for the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, formerly with the Ecofiscal Commission, National Roundtable, and other things. Over to you, Dale.
Great, thanks, Gordon. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little sneak peek at one of the projects that the Institute has underway. So this isn't a final product, it's more of something that's kind of in the middle of things, but still I think quite interesting and builds on some of the other things we've heard this morning. So we're going to talk about the cost of climate change for Canada and bring kind of an economic frame to some of the things we've heard earlier. Next slide, please. So we are a brand new organization, just launched earlier this year. So a quick comment about what the Institute is and where we come from. This is a fully, sorry, back slide, there we go. We're a fully independent organization, arm's length, but funded through the federal government, but entirely nonpartisan, entirely evidence-driven, bringing together experts from a range of disciplines from across the country. And I think that we have a couple things I want to highlight there that kind of drive our mandate. One is this idea of integration, that we are trying to look at issues of mitigation and adaptation and clean growth together rather than separate, and trying to look for those linkages and to bring them all through in different parts of our research. And the second is this idea of clarity, of trying to provide better information to help governments make clear-eyed decisions based on evidence, especially when those choices have big implications for the country and for the prosperity of Canadians. Next slide, please. So I'll take full advantage of Charles' previous presentation to pitch for some other things that we have in the works. So this is a quick look at some of the projects we have underway right now, including some work at carbon budgets and how we can establish governance frameworks to help create the conditions for Canada to get to that net zero destination that Charles talked about. We're doing some work looking at what those pathways to net zero might look like, both for the country as a whole as well for regions. We're doing some work in terms of how to frame those pathways and those outcomes in success measures that are broader than just emissions, and how to explore how the successful pathways to net zero bring in social and economic dimensions as well as those emissions and climate dimensions. And the one I want to talk about today is this last one, this cost of climate change. And this is a big project with a few different threads we'll get into today. But the idea is to explore what the physical impacts of a changing climate are likely to be for Canada in terms of economic impacts. Well, how can we bring lots of good work that explores lots of different impacts across the country or potential impacts across the country and translate those risks into economic terms? Next slide, please. So why do this? Why tackle this challenge? And I've heard a lot of people enthusiastic with the project and others that have questioned why the need to do this. We already know that climate change is a big problem. We already know that these risks are serious and significant. Does putting dollar figures really move the dial and move the conversation in substantive ways? Well, we think it does. And we think that part of it is about bringing new interests into the climate change conversation, both around mitigation and adaptation policy, especially interests that speak in the language of economics. So that's business voices, it's departments of finance at different levels of government. That's partly about raising the stakes for those climate change discussions and bringing the level of those economic impacts home in that different vernacular. But it's also about informing key policy decisions and private decisions as well. And those decisions often get framed in the language of cost-benefit analyses. This study is a sort of spiritual successor to a study from about 10 years ago from the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy called Paying the Price, that tried to do similar things that we're doing here of bringing together a range of different physical impacts from climate change and quantifying those economic dimensions of them, what they mean for the economy. That study was pretty groundbreaking at the time, but it also had lots of limitations. It relied on integrated assessment models for kind of a top-down approach that had a sort of limited frame, both on the climate side and on the economic side, really relied on just a few major damage functions, aggregated at really high levels, and drawing on international data rather than Canadian data at all times. It also did some sector-specific stuff, but it was narrow and focused and had some limitations in how it tackled those things. So there's a reason why it was limited. This is a hard thing to do analytically and technically, but what we're trying to do is to build on that previous work and kind of take the next step. Next slide, please. So our approach is what we're calling a hybrid approach, and this is kind of building on international best practices. Other countries have done similar things. There's a study from Austria in particular that's been kind of very much in this mold. And the idea is to tackle it both from the bottom up and from the top down. So the bottom up is analysis of costs and damages from climate change using process-based models, trying to look at the specific science and the details that feed into those different dimensions of damage, whether it's by sector or hazard type or region. And that's the first phase, and what I'll talk about mostly today. But it's not the end of the story either. In the second phase, we're going to do a macroeconomic analysis and feed those inputs from that bottom-up set of studies, but also a range of other kind of smaller pieces of analysis, and feed them into a macroeconomic model that will look at macroeconomic implications of a changing climate for Canada, but also for regions within Canada. So we'll catch that national story, but also some of the disaggregation that you really need to explore those risks at a sector and regional level. But by using a macroeconomic model, we can capture both kind of the first and second and third order effects of those physical impacts as they ripple through the economy in interesting and sometimes unexpected ways to capture that full story. Next slide, please. So a little bit about those bottom-up analyses and how we are tackling those. And I think the causal chain here kind of gives you the sense. But the idea is we're taking solid data on future climate projections, including work from Francis's institution, PKICS, that we heard about this morning, to look at what those potential climate projections might be for Canada and for regions of Canada, combining them with socioeconomic projections about where population and things like that are going, feeding them into these process-based system models that look at specific aspects of a changing climate. And that can give some of the impacts and damages that we expect from those climate shocks, whether that's impacts on physical assets and infrastructure, whether it's on people and health, whether it is on ecosystems or on the economy more directly. We can then use economic techniques and valuation techniques to try to bring some valuation to what those physical impacts might be in terms of economic impacts and in terms of dollar figures, and how we can start to feed those into that broader framework that starts to tell the story in economic and monetary terms. Next slide, please. So I am no climate scientist, and I will not spend too much time here, but I think it's useful to say that we are grounding this work in the solid evidence that people like you and at this conference are doing to really make sure that we are reflecting that science, the projections of where the climate scenarios are going. A couple scenarios here, a few different time horizons in terms of medium and longer term, and a range of GCM scenarios. Not all of them, not every scenario that Francis and team produce, but a broad range of them to represent kind of a spread of projections for precipitation and temperature that are particularly relevant to our analysis. Next slide, please. This is a somewhat complicated slide that probably wouldn't work if we were in person, but maybe because we're virtual, I'll cheat and put it up. This is one of the first things we've done in our study, and essentially what it is, we are trying to triage which aspects of physical impacts that we're going to include in the study. Inevitably, we can't do everything. We can't do a bottom-up study for absolutely every possible climate hazard across every kind of impact field, across every region of the country. Instead, we're trying to triage the most important ones. We're trying to identify really significant aspects of climate impacts that we can incorporate in our studies, both in terms of these bottom-up pieces and eventually the top-down piece. And we've done that triage as sort of filtering through both on what evidence and research and literature suggests are the most important aspects in terms of the biggest impacts, but also ones that are practically doable for analysis and analytically tractable and practical to include our analysis. So the team calls this the Lego blocks of the analysis, where we are picking and choosing different Lego blocks from this matrix and trying to get the most important ones and filter them into our studies and methodologies. Inevitably, that means we will underestimate the cost of climate change for Canada and underestimate the economic risks for Canada, and we'll be putting a sort of lower bound of potential risks rather than a true precise estimate. But we still think it's a very useful thing to do. Even by defining a lower bound, which we think is going to be quite significant, we can change the narrative and change the way this issue is being talked about in Canada. Okay, so I think one last thing about the slide that's worth highlighting. I think that in a way we forced ourselves into a sort of broad literature review of what's known and not known about the cost of climate change in Canada and the impacts of climate change in Canada. And one thing that maybe unexpectedly came out as well as a sort of side benefit was the fact that there's also still lots of gaps in the knowledge. There's lots of great work and lots of excellent analysis that starts to shine a light on these risks, but also some holes. There's some sort of unknown unknowns about what the impacts of climate will be. And that starts to take us out of a risk conversation into an uncertainty conversation. And I think that matters in how we frame this conversation around future impacts and future risks as well. Next slide, please. So starting to hone in on where we're putting analytical attention, a few specific pieces that we are putting particular attention on, especially for these bottom-up studies in the first wave of studies. Taking a close look at health across a few dimensions, but in particular at infrastructure in terms of buildings and real estate, infrastructure in terms of transportation infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, and taking a bit of a regional look as well at the north, where we're expecting more warming, more impacts, and starting to explore what those implications might be. Next slide, please. So let me start with that health piece and just a little bit. So there's a few categories of economic impacts and economic costs that we're going to work on. And that'll include direct implications. So we're looking at burdens on healthcare systems from increased illness, increased morbidity from disease, from heat, etc. We're also looking at indirect costs. Now, those manifest in terms of lost productivity to the economy. The economy is making less strong use of people as labor, as inputs to the economy because of those illness and morbidity impacts. And finally, we're looking at what economists would call a sort of willingness to pay or a disutility impact. And essentially here, it's the statistical value of life and well-being and what society is willing to pay, so to speak, to avoid those kind of significant impacts on people's health and people's lives. Lots of overlaps in those different aspects of health impacts and cost impacts. So to be a little careful not to simply add them all up, but they start to shine an interesting light on where those impacts are manifesting, not just in terms of health outcomes alone, but how we can translate those health outcomes into economic factors. Next slide, please. Similar story for the infrastructure. This is our most complicated bottom-up study, and it's taking lots of thinking and lots of different aspects here, especially because we're looking at lots of different kinds of infrastructure. But as I said, real estate, impacts on roads and transportation infrastructure from roads to airports, electricity grids. That's some interesting overlaps with the net zero work on the mitigation side. If you spend time in mitigation world alone, you hear lots about the need for electrification and building up more electricity generation, more electricity distribution, and more electricity use to start to shift away from fossil fuel combustion. But some interesting overactions. Thanks, Renee. Interactions there with resilience when that infrastructure may actually be exposed to climate shocks in interesting ways. Next slide, please. So I will basically wrap up here, but this is the map of the upcoming publication schedule. So we're kind of a lay of the land, similar to what I've said here today. And in the fall, that health bottom-up study towards the early calendar year, infrastructure in the spring, tentatively going to do that northern one in the summer, and we'll do the macroeconomic piece next fall. So we have our hands full for sure. Next slide, please. So my name and contact is up here, but I would be remiss not to flag my teammates as well. Ryan Ness is our Director of Adaptation and speaks to this in more authority than I do. And his team of Dylan Clark is also a major player in this work as well. So if you do have questions, reach out to me and I may well redirect you to the actual experts. Thank you very much.